Entire cities vanished without a trace, rivers ran red, streets became tombs, and monuments were built from human skulls. He promised mercy but kept it in the most horrifying way imaginable. This is the story of Tamerlane, the conqueror whose cruelty rewrote history. Born in 1336, near the city of Kesh, in the region of Transoxiana, in what is now Uzbekistan, Timur emerged from a lineage of minor Turkic Mongol nobility. His family, the Barlas tribe, had long been part of the Mongol confederations that survived the fragmentation of Genghis Khan's empire. Though they held noble status, their influence was limited, and Timur's early environment was defined by a landscape of fragmented principalities, tribal rivalries, and constant military turbulence. At the age of 8, Timur reportedly experienced a formative injury in a battle, leaving him with a permanent limp, a mark that would earn him the name Timur Lang, or Tamerlane, Timur the Lame. While his disability might have been seen as a limitation, it became part of his calculated persona, reinforcing an image of determination and resilience. From an early age, Timur displayed an unusual combination of physical courage, intellectual curiosity, and political ambition. He was fascinated by the tales of Genghis Khan and the Mongol conquests, studying their strategies and the networks they created across Eurasia. Timur's claim to legitimacy was rooted in these historical precedents. Though he was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, he leveraged a distant familial connection through marriage and tribal affiliations to assert a symbolic lineage. This claim was not merely vanity. In the steppe and Central Asian politics of the 14th century, ancestral ties to the Mongols conferred authority and the right to lead armies across contested territories. Timur's vision extended beyond personal power. He imagined restoring the Mongol Empire to its former glory, uniting the fragmented regions of Central Asia under a single banner, and projecting influence across Persia, India, and the Middle East. Even in his early campaigns, Timur combined intelligence with brutality. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already begun forming a loyal core of soldiers, mostly Turco-Mongol warriors familiar with steppe warfare, who were drawn to his strategic ingenuity. Timur understood that victory relied not solely on numbers or brute force but on psychological dominance. Cities and rivals would yield not merely to the sword, but to the reputation of a leader whose methods were both unpredictable and absolute. Chroniclers from the period noted his careful attention to logistics, troop morale, and timing, emphasizing that Timur's campaigns were meticulously planned, with each march and siege designed to maximize both efficiency and terror. While his intellect and strategic acumen were exceptional, they existed alongside a capacity for extreme violence. Timur observed how fear could be weaponized, and he learned from the Mongols that terror was as effective as conquest in ensuring compliance. Unlike other regional leaders, who often spared populations after submission for taxation or labor, Timur's early victories demonstrated his willingness to treat cities and armies as instruments for projecting power. These actions cultivated a reputation that would precede him, enabling him to secure surrenders before battles began and to orchestrate campaigns where psychological control was as critical as physical domination. By his mid-20s, Timur had begun consolidating power across the fragmented regions of Central Asia, using a combination of alliances, marriage, politics, and calculated force. His rise was marked by a careful balance of intellect and intimidation. The geography of Transoxiana, with its trade routes and fortified cities, became the initial proving ground for his military experiments, while his administrative decisions hinted at a leader who understood that sustaining an empire required organization as much as fear. This foundation would allow him, in later decades, to execute campaigns across Persia, India, and the Middle East, where strategic brilliance and unprecedented brutality would redefine the scale and method of conquest in the late medieval world. By the end of his formative years, Timur had established not only control over key territories, but a blueprint for domination, a combination of disciplined armies, ruthless enforcement of obedience, and a psychological edge that turned his reputation into a preemptive weapon. It was a model of power that fused intellect with terror, ambition with calculation, and set the stage for the extraordinary and horrifying career that would follow. Tamerlane's genius was not confined to the battlefield. What set him apart from nearly every other conqueror in history was his understanding that fear could be as powerful as an army. For Timur, terror was not merely a byproduct of conquest. It was a deliberate tool, meticulously designed to manipulate populations, enforce obedience, and ensure that resistance became unthinkable. He understood that the reputation of a conqueror could preempt rebellion, making entire cities surrender without a fight, simply at the whisper of his name. Unlike rulers who sought to govern conquered lands, extracting taxes and labor to sustain their empires, Tamerlane often treated submission as insufficient. Cities that resisted his campaigns were punished so completely that they ceased to exist. He elevated destruction to a strategic art form. His campaigns were not always about annexation. They were about obliteration, erasing cities, destroying infrastructure, and leaving monuments to his conquests as perpetual warnings. This approach instilled a pervasive fear that traveled ahead of his armies, a psychological prelude to his physical campaigns. Tamerlane understood the power of perception. He often made promises, sometimes of mercy or safety, knowing that the recipients would take them at face value. Yet he interpreted these promises in the most literal or twisted sense possible. Soldiers surrendered expecting leniency, only to find themselves buried alive or executed in systematically horrifying ways. In every instance, he technically honored his word, but the interpretation served his purposes of terror, demonstrating that submission did not guarantee safety. This strategic manipulation of expectation reinforced his reputation as a master of psychological warfare. The concept of calculated cruelty was central to his empire-building strategy. Tamerlane did not act out of uncontrolled rage or caprice. He acted with deliberate intention. Each massacre, each destruction of a city, was measured to achieve maximum strategic impact. The erasure of populations, the toppling of cultural centers, and the construction of symbolic monuments of terror served as instruments to control both the conquered and those who might challenge him in the future. By blending cruelty with calculation, he made fear a commodity that could be deployed as reliably as cavalry on the battlefield. Tamerlane's psychological control extended beyond simple intimidation. He cultivated the perception of inevitability. His campaigns were inevitable, his victories preordained. Word of his previous conquests spread rapidly across Central Asia, Persia, and India. Reports of entire populations annihilated, of cities razed and repurposed into farmland, of pyramids of skulls rising in public squares, created an almost mythical aura. Leaders facing him knew that defiance carried consequences of unimaginable scale, and the mere threat of his approach could dissolve resistance. This reputation as a harbinger of calculated destruction was not incidental. Timur's campaigns were carefully timed, coordinated, and executed to maximize their psychological effect. Armies were positioned to overawe, spies spread stories of horrors yet to come, and envoys delivered messages of surrender framed in the context of survival or annihilation. By blending meticulous planning with terror, Tamerlane transformed cruelty into a strategic instrument, turning human suffering into a calculable force multiplier. Ultimately, the psychology of terror allowed Tamerlane to extend his influence far beyond the territories he physically occupied. Fear became a preemptive weapon, compelling submission and reducing the cost of conquest. His methods were designed to leave an indelible imprint on memory, ensuring that the name of Tamerlane was synonymous with absolute authority, mercilessness, and a form of domination that transcended mere governance. Where other rulers sought to rule, Tamerlane sought to command through the orchestration of fear itself, a system of power as intricate as it was horrifying, laying the foundation for the catastrophic campaigns that would follow across Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Middle East. In the year 1400, the city of Sivas, located in present-day central Turkey, faced an army whose reputation alone was enough to strike terror into the hearts of even the most seasoned defenders. Tamerlane's approach to conquest had already traveled far ahead of him. Whispers of entire populations erased and cities reduced to rubble preceded his arrival. The garrison of Sivas, primarily Armenian soldiers, understood the choice before them: fight and almost certainly die, or surrender in hopes of survival. When the defenders finally sent envoys to negotiate terms, Tamerlane made a promise: not a single drop of their blood would be spilled. It was a solemn oath, sworn before witnesses, the kind of promise that commanders in medieval warfare were expected to honor, and the soldiers, desperate and outnumbered, placed their trust in that promise. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men laid down their weapons and opened the gates, expecting mercy or at least a delay before the inevitable slaughter. What followed was a demonstration of calculated cruelty, unlike anything recorded before. Tamerlane's army had prepared enormous trenches outside the city walls, massive pits, dug to precise dimensions. Contemporary chroniclers describe the scene with a mixture of horror and awe. The prisoners were marched into the trenches in groups. At first, some refused, some attempted to flee, but there was no escape. They were forced in, and then the earth began to fall. Shovels at first, then carts of dirt, then torrents of soil poured over men who screamed, struggled, and suffocated. Those at the bottom were crushed by the bodies above. Those higher up faced a slow, agonizing death from suffocation. Chroniclers noted that some victims endured for hours in the darkness, trapped beneath tons of earth, their cries fading into silence. Technically, Tamerlane had kept his promise. No swords, no arrows, no spilling of blood. Yet the method of execution amplified the psychological terror tenfold. Eyewitness accounts emphasize the surreal combination of order and horror. One contemporary chronicler, writing decades later, detailed the meticulousness of the operation, noting how Tamerlane personally oversaw the proceedings to ensure efficiency. Every trench, every group of prisoners, every shovelful of dirt was carefully coordinated. This was not random slaughter. It was an engineered spectacle designed to imprint the conqueror's power into the minds of all who heard of it. The massacre at Sivas had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. News of the buried soldiers spread rapidly across the region, carried by merchants, diplomats, and refugees. Tamerlane's reputation as a psychological tactician grew. Cities preparing to face him did so with the knowledge that surrender, however seemingly safe, might result in unimaginable horrors. The act at Sivas demonstrated a new form of warfare. Terror deployed with precision, turning fear into a preemptive weapon. Strategically, the event served multiple purposes. It eliminated a resisting garrison entirely, ensured the city's submission, and created a legend that would ripple across the Middle East and Central Asia. By fusing brutality with meticulous planning, Tamerlane converted horror into an instrument of control, allowing his name alone to influence the decisions of rulers and soldiers even before a battle began. The buried soldiers of Sivas were more than victims. They were an extension of Tamerlane's strategy. Their deaths communicated a clear message. Promises could be twisted, mercy could be redefined, and resistance would invite suffering beyond comprehension. By the time his army moved on, the story of Sivas had already cemented itself as a cautionary tale, ensuring that fear preceded the footsteps of Tamerlane wherever he marched next. Urgench, the capital of the Khwarezmian region in Central Asia, was a jewel along the Silk Road. By the late 14th century, it had grown wealthy from trade, boasting bustling markets, libraries, mosques, and homes adorned with intricate carvings. Its streets thrived with scholars, merchants, and artisans, making it not just a city of commerce, but a center of culture and learning. In 1388, Tamerlane advanced on Urgench after receiving word of a rebellion, a brazen defiance, following an earlier surrender to his rule. The rebellion was a direct affront to his authority, and Tamerlane treated it as a personal insult. Unlike other conquerors, who might punish only military leaders or symbolic figures, Tamerlane enacted a policy of total annihilation. He sought to remove not merely resistance, but the very existence of the city itself. Contemporary chronicles describe the siege as swift and merciless. His forces surrounded Urgench, breaching the city walls with the same efficiency that had become his signature. Once the walls fell, there would be no selective retribution. Men, women, children, and the elderly were massacred. The killing was systematic, executed street by street. Chroniclers recount rivers of blood flowing through the streets, a horrifying testament to the scale of human loss. Soldiers followed precise instructions: eliminate every inhabitant without exception. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but a premeditated strategy. Tamerlane's army also destroyed infrastructure with meticulous care. Every home, shop, library, and mosque was demolished. Buildings that had taken decades to construct were reduced to rubble, leaving the city stripped of both life and architecture. But Tamerlane's destruction went beyond physical demolition. According to multiple sources, he ordered the rubble to be plowed and barley sown over the site. This symbolic act signified a complete unmaking. Urgench was no longer a city to be rebuilt or remembered. It was farmland. Whether literal or metaphorical, The act sent a message across Central Asia. Rebellion would erase history itself. The psychological effect was profound. Other cities along the Silk Road, from Samarkand to Bukhara, understood immediately that resistance carried not merely death, but obliteration. Tamerlane had turned destruction into theater, and terror into a preemptive weapon. Total annihilation of this scale was unprecedented in medieval warfare. Most conquerors sought to dominate, not erase. Cities were valuable. Their populations could pay taxes. Their artisans could be enslaved. Their resources exploited. Tamerlane, by contrast, prioritized reputation and deterrence over immediate economic or political gain. The annihilation of Urgench created a chilling incentive for cities to surrender preemptively, often before his army arrived. Fear of Tamerlane spread faster than his soldiers could march. The legacy of Urgench endured. Archaeological studies today struggle to locate remnants of the original city. Chroniclers noted that even decades later, travelers and traders spoke of the city that vanished, a cautionary tale meant to remind all of Tamerlane's reach and ruthlessness. By targeting not only the population but also the culture and infrastructure, he ensured that no immediate revival could take place. In one act, he erased centuries of human endeavor, knowledge, and social life. Strategically, the destruction of Urgench reinforced Tamerlane's mastery of psychological warfare. By annihilating an entire urban center, he established a pattern. Surrender could bring mercy. Defiance guaranteed erasure. News of the city's fate radiated along trade routes, influencing decisions in Samarkand, Herat, and beyond. Tamerlane's message was simple, yet terrifyingly effective. He did not merely conquer, he rewrote the map of power, culture, and human survival itself. The fall of Urgench marked a turning point in Tamerlane's campaigns. It demonstrated the extreme lengths to which he would go to maintain authority, and the unprecedented nature of his methods. Scholars and chroniclers of the time, even those accustomed to the brutal realities of warfare, were struck by the scale and methodical precision of his annihilation. Urgench was not just defeated, it ceased to exist. Its disappearance became both a strategic instrument and a psychological weapon, ensuring that Tamerlane's name would resonate with fear along every road, in every market, and through every court of Central Asia. In 1387, Tamerlane's army advanced on Isfahan, one of Persia's most prominent cities, renowned for its culture, scholarship, and strategic location along trade routes. The city had initially surrendered, seeking to avoid bloodshed, but Tamerlane's growing reputation as an unforgiving conqueror created a tense environment. Despite assurances of clemency, elements of the population resisted an act Tamerlane considered an intolerable challenge to his authority. His response would be decisive, calculated, and horrifying. Once the city fell, Tamerlane enacted one of his most infamous acts of terror. Contemporary chroniclers describe the construction of towers made entirely of human skulls, intended to mark both punishment and deterrence. Soldiers were ordered to gather the corpses of the executed men, women, and even children who had resisted or been implicated in the rebellion. The skulls were cleaned, stacked, and meticulously arranged into towering structures in the city's squares and along major thoroughfares. Some reports suggest these towers reached over 10 meters high, visible from outside the city walls, a grisly monument of obedience enforced through fear. The scale of the punishment cannot be overstated. Tens of thousands were executed, though estimates vary between sources. One chronicler, Sharaf al-Din Ali Yazdi, writing decades later, remarked on the sheer immensity of the towers, noting that the sight alone could cause entire towns to surrender at the mere rumor of Tamerlane's arrival. The towers functioned not merely as displays of cruelty, but as instruments of psychological warfare. They conveyed a simple, unambiguous message. Defiance would result in total annihilation, and disobedience would be immortalized in public horror. For those within Isfahan, the experience was traumatizing. Streets once filled with bustling markets and the daily rhythm of life were transformed into corridors of death and terror. Survivors were forced to witness the towers as a warning, an inescapable reminder that Tamerlane's justice was absolute and visible. The spectacle of the towers turned punishment into public theater. The living became part of the performance, witnesses to the cost of rebellion, reinforcing the conqueror's power in a way that extended beyond the battlefield. Historical sources vary in their descriptions, but all emphasize the psychological impact. Persian chroniclers and Arab historians alike recorded the event. passing down stories that emphasized both horror and strategic brilliance. Yazdi, Ibn Arabasha, and other contemporary observers detailed how the towers were used to intimidate neighboring regions even before Tamerlane's armies arrived. Word of the towers spread rapidly along the Silk Road and throughout the Persian heartland. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers recounted the images of skulls stacked in perfect geometric order, ensuring that Tamerlane's reputation as a ruler of both intellect and terror preceded him. Tamerlane's approach differed from other conquerors of the period. While many rulers exacted vengeance on rebellious populations, few transformed execution into symbolic architecture. The towers of Isfahan were not only punitive, they were pedagogical, teaching cities, kingdoms, and future generations the costs of disobedience. The psychological effect extended far beyond Isfahan. Cities in neighboring regions, hearing reports of the towers, often surrendered without resistance, understanding that survival depended on submission. In this way, the horror served as a force multiplier for Tamerlane's campaigns. The construction of skull towers also reflected his meticulous attention to both planning and symbolism. They were erected in central squares, near city gates, and along trade arteries. Their presence was carefully calculated. They would be among the first sights for anyone entering or leaving the city. By converting the dead into instruments of empire, Tamerlane blurred the line between conquest and spectacle. History remembers the towers not only as acts of cruelty, but as enduring markers of the strategic use of fear. The enduring legacy of the towers of Isfahan lies in their place within collective memory. For centuries, travelers recounted their horror, ensuring that Tamerlane's reputation was cemented across empires. Scholars note that such acts were as much about narrative control as territorial control. By transforming rebellion into visual, visceral terror, he communicated a clear directive. To resist Tamerlane was to invite not death alone, but spectacle, shame, and historical erasure. In the story of Isfahan we see the deliberate intersection of power, cruelty, and strategy. Tamerlane was not merely a warrior. He was a historian of fear, crafting monuments from human bones to shape the future of entire regions. The towers of Isfahan stood as silent witnesses to the consequences of defiance, a grim chapter in the history of conquest where terror became both weapon and message, extending his dominion not only over lands but over the human mind itself. In 1398, Tamerlane turned his ambitions toward the wealth and power of northern India. Delhi, the capital of the Tughlaq dynasty, stood as a city of immense strategic and cultural significance, a hub of trade, scholarship, and political authority. For Tamerlane, the city represented both opportunity and a test of his reputation. To conquer Delhi was to demonstrate his supremacy across Asia. His army, hardened by decades of campaigns across Persia and Central Asia, advanced with disciplined precision, carrying the weight of both ambition and terror. Before even reaching the city walls, Tamerlane demonstrated the ruthless efficiency that would define his campaigns. Chroniclers report that he executed tens of thousands of prisoners, figures often cited near 100,000 captured in earlier engagements in northern India. This preemptive slaughter was both logistical and psychological. It reduced the burden of guarding prisoners during the campaign while simultaneously sending a stark warning to Delhi's defenders. The message was clear: resistance would be met with indiscriminate annihilation. Delhi's defenses, formidable on paper, were ill-prepared for the combination of Tamerlane's tactical ingenuity and psychological warfare. The city relied heavily on war elephants, creatures as imposing as they were unpredictable. Tamerlane's forces countered this traditional advantage with discipline, speed, and calculated coordination. Infantry and cavalry were deployed to target the elephants' weaknesses, using crossbows, fire, and coordinated volleys to disrupt their ranks. The chaos of battle favored the organized and ruthless attacker, and Tamerlane's forces exploited every gap. Eyewitness accounts describe the battlefield as a maelstrom of trampling beasts, screaming soldiers, and clouds of dust rising over bodies, a vivid demonstration of the conqueror's audacity and strategic acumen. Once the city fell, the devastation was systematic and total. Streets became rivers of blood, buildings collapsed under fire and siege engines, and the city's wealth was seized or destroyed. Libraries, repositories of centuries of Persian, Indian, and Islamic knowledge, were burned. Manuscripts and scholarly works disappeared in flames, erasing intellectual heritage as part of the conquest. Slavery became another instrument of terror. The surviving population was stripped of property, family, and freedom, forced into labor or sold to distant markets. By converting both people and structures into instruments of empire, Tamerlane reinforced the message that Delhi's fate would be the fate of any city that resisted him. The scale of destruction in Delhi surpassed anything the region had experienced in living memory. Chroniclers describe scenes of apocalyptic ruin, marketplaces flattened, mosques defiled, and palaces reduced to charred ruins. Entire neighborhoods vanished, leaving skeletal remnants of homes and streets. Survivors, traumatized and scattered, carried the memory of horror into surrounding regions. Reports of Delhi's annihilation spread swiftly, reinforcing Tamerlane's reputation as a conqueror whose authority relied as much on fear as on military skill. The conquest had profound long-term consequences. Politically, the Tughlaq dynasty never recovered its former strength, leaving northern India fractured and vulnerable to future invasions. Economically, the loss of wealth, infrastructure, and skilled labor destabilized trade routes and reduced the city's influence. Culturally, centuries of accumulated knowledge and art were irretrievably lost. Delhi's transformation into a symbolic graveyard demonstrated the power of total warfare and approach, where victory was measured not only in territory gained but in the obliteration of the enemy's capacity to resist or rebuild. Tamerlane's sack of Delhi also exemplified the strategic use of terror on an unprecedented scale. Every act, the pre-battle executions, the tactical deployment against war elephants, the methodical burning and enslavement was designed to reinforce obedience through fear. News of Delhi's destruction traveled far and wide, reaching other kingdoms, sultans, and empires. Entire regions preemptively surrendered or offered tribute rather than risk repeating Delhi's fate. In this sense, Tamerlane extended his empire not merely through conquest, but through the reputation of indiscriminate, calculated cruelty. The narrative of Delhi's fall remained a cautionary tale for generations. Historians of the era and later centuries recorded the horrors, emphasizing both the scale of loss and the precision of Tamerlane's methods. The city, once vibrant and thriving, became synonymous with apocalyptic devastation. For Tamerlane, the sack of Delhi was not a single act of war, it was a demonstration of absolute power. A psychological and physical template for conquest, and a chilling example of how terror can serve as both weapon and governance. Delhi in 1398 was transformed into a landscape of ruin and despair, a testament to the ruthlessness of its conqueror. The bloodshed, destruction of knowledge, and enslavement of survivors were not anomalies of battle. They were deliberate strategies, meticulously executed to send a message across continents. In reducing Delhi to ashes, Tamerlane etched his name into history, not merely as a brilliant tactician, but as an architect of terror whose campaigns reshaped the political and cultural map of Asia for decades to come. In 1401, Tamerlane set his sights on Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate and a city steeped in centuries of Islamic scholarship, trade, and culture. Initially, the city's leadership sought to placate him, offering tribute and submission to avoid conflict. But Tamerlane's campaign was not merely about acquisition, it was a demonstration of absolute authority. When Baghdad's rulers hesitated, emboldened by their city's grandeur and wealth, they triggered a siege that would become one of the most notorious episodes of calculated terror in history. The siege of Baghdad was methodical and ruthless. Tamerlane's forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies and isolating the population. Yet the horror did not end at walls. He implemented what chroniclers refer to as the quota system for his soldiers, a grotesque method of incentivizing slaughter. Each soldier was assigned a quota of heads to return with, a practice designed to maximize both fear and obedience. The scale of this carnage was staggering. Contemporary accounts speak of tens of thousands of corpses. The streets of Baghdad transformed into avenues of terror. Families, scholars, and soldiers alike fell victim, with survival often determined solely by whether one could flee or hide. Once the city was breached, Tamerlane's infamous construction of towers from human skulls began, surpassing even the grotesque measures taken in Isfahan years earlier. Witnesses described pyramids of skulls erected in public squares, stretching higher than the surrounding city walls. Each skull represented a life, a family, a community erased, yet together they formed a monument of warning. The spectacle was both psychological and strategic, a message not only to Baghdad's surviving population but to the Islamic world at large. To see these towers was to witness the consequences of resistance firsthand. Yet Tamerlane's terror was not unrestrained. Certain religious sites, mosques, and key institutions were intentionally spared. This selective preservation was a calculated strategy, designed to project the image of a ruler who, though brutally enforcing obedience, understood and respected the sacred. By combining extreme violence with measured restraint, he reinforced his image as a conqueror whose cruelty was deliberate, purposeful, and inexorably tied to political and spiritual logic. Survival within his empire was conditional, but the conditionality itself amplified his control. The destruction extended beyond human casualties. Baghdad's architecture, libraries, markets, and public spaces suffered unprecedented devastation. Centuries of cultural and intellectual heritage were lost in the flames. Scholars, scribes, and artisans, those who had made Baghdad the center of learning in the Islamic world, were slaughtered or dispersed. Trade routes faltered as merchants fled, reducing the city's wealth and influence. This deliberate obliteration of both life and legacy served as a warning that Tamerlane's campaigns were as much about rewriting the political and cultural map as they were about territorial conquest. The psychological impact of Baghdad's fall was immediate and far-reaching. Across the Islamic world, reports of the siege, the slaughter, and the Towers of Skulls circulated quickly, reaching cities like Damascus, Cairo, and beyond. Leaders, merchants, and populations understood that defiance would invite catastrophic consequences. Baghdad became the ultimate example of Tamerlane's strategic philosophy. Terror was not an ancillary feature of conquest, but a central instrument of empire building. Fear itself became a currency, more valuable than gold, more persuasive than diplomacy. Chroniclers of the time, from Persian historians to Arab scribes, documented the events with both horror and awe. They recorded not only the numbers killed or the structures destroyed, but also the psychological mastery Tamerlane wielded. Unlike previous conquerors, whose brutality might have been episodic, Tamerlane's approach combined meticulous planning, ritualized violence, and strategic messaging. The siege of Baghdad was a culmination of decades of learning, each prior act of terror a precursor, refining methods that would leave indelible marks on history. The fall of Baghdad also illustrates the duality of Tamerlane's genius. On one hand, he engineered mass death on an unprecedented scale. On the other, he exercised restraint where it would enhance his authority. The Towers of Skulls, the destroyed marketplaces, and the rivers of blood communicated immediate consequences, while the sparing of key religious sites communicated long-term political calculation. Through terror, he consolidated control. Through selective preservation, he legitimized it. Baghdad's destruction was a masterpiece not only of military might, but of psychological warfare, demonstrating how fear could be wielded with precision to secure empire. By the time Tamerlane departed, Baghdad was irreversibly altered. The city's population was decimated, its economy crippled, and its intellectual life scattered. The Abbasid Caliphate, already weakened, would never recover its former glory. The lessons of Baghdad resonated across the region. Resistance invited annihilation, and the reputation of Tamerlane would precede him like a shadow over every city along his path. In history, Baghdad stands as both a symbol of human resilience and a chilling testament to the scale and sophistication of terror as a tool of empire. By the time of Tamerlane's death in 1405, his empire stretched across Persia, Central Asia, Mesopotamia, parts of India, and even into the Caucasus, a vast expanse held together, less by institutions than by the terror of its founder. Cities submitted before armies even arrived. Rulers capitulated to avoid witnessing the horrors of past conquests. And merchants, scholars, and local elites calculated survival over resistance. Fear had become the most effective instrument of empire, a psychological weapon that preceded his banners. Tamerlane's genius lay not only in his military strategy but in the cultivation of a reputation so pervasive that it often neutralized opposition before battle. News of Towers of Skulls, cities razed to ashes, and rivers of blood traveled faster than his armies. Tales of Urgench, Isfahan, Delhi, and Baghdad circulated in caravans, courts, and mosques, ensuring that entire populations considered surrender preferable to defiance. In this sense, Tamerlane's empire was both smaller and larger than maps suggest. Smaller because few regions were truly loyal. Larger because the reach of his fear extended beyond his armies. Yet this empire, terrifying as it was, remained fragile. Tamerlane centralized power around his personal authority and his presence on the battlefield. Governance relied heavily on the threat of immediate retribution rather than sustainable administration. After his death, the empire fragmented rapidly, divided among sons and grandsons who lacked his combination of charisma, tactical brilliance, and ruthless decisiveness. Cities that once trembled at the mere mention of his name began asserting independence, illustrating the inherent instability of a dominion built primarily on terror. Despite the empire's short-lived cohesion, Tamerlane's reputation endured for centuries. Chroniclers from Europe to the Islamic world recounted his campaigns as cautionary tales of what human ambition, combined with strategic cruelty, could achieve. His name became synonymous with both genius and horror, appearing in history's poems and even folklore as the archetype of a conqueror who wielded fear as precisely as a sword. Long after his skull towers crumbled and his cities rebuilt, the psychological imprint remained a testament to the enduring power of terror in human affairs. Ultimately, Tamerlane's story offers sobering lessons about power, psychology, and cruelty. True dominion requires more than armies and fortresses. It can be enforced with reputation alone. Yet, reliance on fear as the primary glue of an empire carries inherent fragility. Tamerlane achieved feats of destruction and conquest that few have matched. But his empire's dissolution after his death underscores the limits of terror as a foundation for lasting rule. The legacy he left behind is paradoxical: a world reshaped by violence, a cautionary tale of ambition, and a reminder that fear, though effective, is always ephemeral without enduring structures to sustain it. Tamerlane's campaigns left a scar across continents, with death toll estimates ranging from 4 to 6 million people, a staggering figure in the context of the 14th century, representing perhaps 5 to 10% of the world's population at the time. Entire cities were depopulated, and regions that once thrived as commercial or cultural centers were reduced to rubble. Historians note that some areas, particularly in Persia, Iraq, and northern India, took generations to recover from the demographic and economic devastation. For survivors, life was marked by trauma and displacement. Families who had witnessed mass executions, the decimation of soldiers and civilians alike, faced the collapse of social structures and the loss of cultural heritage. Libraries were burned, artisans slaughtered or enslaved, and local governance replaced by fear-driven compliance. Oral histories describe the endless mourning of towns emptied of life, while merchants and travelers spread word of his conquests, further reinforcing the psychological domination of regions far beyond the battlefield. Culturally, Tamerlane's campaigns erased centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition in certain regions. In Delhi, the burning of libraries and destruction of public infrastructure meant the loss of texts, records, and scientific knowledge. In cities like Urgench and Isfahan, once vibrant hubs of trade and learning, the annihilation of civic life left voids that shaped regional development for decades. The human cost was not merely numeric. It was a fracture in the continuity of civilization itself. Philosophically, Tamerlane presents a complex study in morality and strategy. He combined brilliance in tactics, administration, and psychological warfare with a willingness to employ indiscriminate cruelty. His campaigns challenge historians to consider the intersections of power, fear, and ethics. Could his strategic use of terror be justified as a method of empire building? Or does it remain an enduring example of humanity's capacity for systematic destruction? The very fascination with his life lies in this tension between genius and horror, ambition and atrocity. Even centuries later, Tamerlane continues to captivate and horrify. His story is taught as both a warning and a lesson in the extremes of human behavior. Scholars study the efficiency of his military campaigns, while others dwell on the moral implications of his actions. Documentaries, books, and research continually revisit the scale of his impact, not only because of the numbers killed or cities destroyed, but because of what those acts reveal about the human condition. Ambition without restraint, the power of reputation, and the fragile balance between fear and governance. Tamerlane's legacy endures as a reflection on the human cost of conquest, a testament to both the ingenuity and brutality that have shaped history. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for organized violence, the fragility of civilization, and the enduring imprint of fear as a tool of power. In the ruins and in the tales passed down, the human cost of his empire remains palpable, reminding us that history is measured not only in victories but in the lives irrevocably altered or extinguished.